You know that moment when everyone thinks you're losing your mind, but you're actually 3 steps ahead of them? My name is Dolores Baker, though everyone calls me Dolly, and at 74 years old, I've learned that being underestimated might just be a woman's greatest superpower. Picture this scene. You're sitting at your own dining room table, the same mahogany table where you raised 4 children, hosted countless holidays, and weathered every storm life threw at you. But now, those same children are looking at you like you've completely lost touch with reality. Why? Because you mentioned your financial advisor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His name is Vincent Chen, and according to my family, he doesn't exist. They think I'm talking to thin air. They think I'm developing dementia. They think I need to be put in a home where someone else can make my decisions for me. What they don't know is that Vincent Chen has been quietly building me a portfolio worth over $1 billion. Yes, you heard that right. 1 billion with a capital B. But here's the thing about family, especially when you're a widow in your 70s. They stop seeing you as a person with a mind of your own. They start seeing you as a problem to be managed, a responsibility to be handled, a burden to be shared among themselves. They forget that you once ran a household, balanced budgets, and made decisions that kept everyone fed, clothed, and safe. They forget that you might still have a few tricks up your sleeve. This is the story of how my own children tried to have me declared incompetent, how they followed me around like I was a flight risk, and how they nearly fainted when Vincent Chen walked through my front door with a briefcase full of documents. That would change everything they thought they knew about their old, confused mother. But the real shock? The truth about who Vincent Chen really is will leave you speechless. My story begins on a Tuesday evening in October, the kind of crisp autumn night that makes you grateful for a warm home and family around the dinner table. I had prepared my famous pot roast, the recipe I'd perfected over 40 years of marriage to my late husband Harold. The smell of herbs and tender beef filled every corner of my modest 2-story house on Maple Street, the same house where I'd raised my 4 children. Margaret, my eldest at 52, sat to my right, her lawyer's posture straight and her expression perpetually serious. She'd driven in from her downtown condo, still wearing her expensive business suit, checking her phone every few minutes like the world might end if she missed an email. To her left sat Robert, my middle son at 49, whose expanding waistline spoke to his success in the insurance business and his wife's excellent cooking. Across from them, Jessica, my youngest daughter at 45, bounced between helping serve and chasing after her 8-year-old twins who were more interested in playing tag than sitting still for Grandma's dinner. My second son, David, had called to say he couldn't make it. Work emergency, he claimed, though I suspected it had more to do with his new girlfriend than any crisis at his accounting firm. At 47, David was still searching for something, though he'd never admit it out loud. The conversation flowed as it usually did during our monthly family dinners. Margaret dominated with stories from her law firm, important cases, and difficult clients. Robert shared updates about his insurance business and his wife Linda's latest community theater production. Jessica juggled contributing to the conversation while managing her children's behavior with the practiced efficiency of a mother who'd learned to multitask out of necessity. I listened, as I always did, offering the appropriate responses and asking the right questions. But there was something different about this particular evening, something that had been building inside me for months, a growing sense that my children saw me not as Dolores Baker, a woman with her own thoughts and experiences, but as their elderly mother who needed to be managed and monitored. It started with small things. Margaret insisting on balancing my checkbook during her visits. Robert questioning every household repair I mentioned, suggesting I was being taken advantage of by contractors. Jessica constantly asking if I was eating enough, sleeping enough, taking my medications properly. They meant well, I knew that. But their concern had gradually transformed into something that felt more like surveillance than love. The conversation turned, as it inevitably did, to my daily routine. Margaret wanted to know how I'd been spending my time, whether I was staying active, whether I'd been socializing with other women my age. It was then that I mentioned Vincent. "I had coffee with Vincent this morning," I said casually, cutting another piece of pot roast. "We discussed some adjustments to my portfolio based on the recent market fluctuations." The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Even Jessica's twins seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere and stopped their chatter. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Robert's eyebrows knitted together in that way they'd done since he was a little boy trying to solve a puzzle. Jessica looked confused, glancing between her siblings as if searching for an explanation. "Vincent?" Margaret asked slowly, her lawyer's voice taking on that careful tone she used when questioning a witness. "Vincent who, Mom?" "Vincent Chen," I replied, surprised by their reaction. "My financial advisor. I've mentioned him before." Another silence, this one heavier than the first. Margaret and Robert exchanged one of those looks that adult children share when they think their parent isn't paying attention. It was a look I'd become all too familiar with over the past year, a silent communication that excluded me from my own conversations. "Mom," Robert said gently, leaning forward with the patience one might use with a confused child, "you don't have a financial advisor. We've talked about this. Your finances are simple. Social Security, Dad's pension, the small savings account. There's no need for a financial advisor." I felt something twist in my chest, a combination of hurt and frustration that was becoming increasingly familiar. Of course I have a financial advisor. Vincent has been helping me for over a year now. We meet every Tuesday morning at Central Park, by the fountain. Jessica's expression shifted to concern. "Mom, are you feeling all right? You might be thinking of someone else, or maybe you saw someone on television." "I am not confused," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Vincent Chen is a very real person. He's helped me understand investment strategies and market trends. Just this morning, he explained how the tech sector volatility might affect my portfolio. Margaret set down her fork with a decisive clink against her plate. "Mother, listen to me carefully. There is no Vincent Chen. We've never met this person. You've never mentioned him before tonight, and you certainly don't have a portfolio that requires professional management." The condescension in her voice ignited something fierce inside me. Here was my daughter, the child I'd nursed through chickenpox and homework struggles and teenage heartbreak, speaking to me like I was a senile old woman who couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. "Just because you haven't met him doesn't mean he doesn't exist," I said evenly. "Vincent is a very private person. He prefers to keep our professional relationship discreet." Robert shook his head, his expression a mixture of pity and concern. "Mom, this is exactly what Dr. Martinez was talking about at your last checkup. Sometimes as we age, our minds can play tricks on us. We might think we're having conversations with people who aren't really there." "My mind is perfectly clear," I insisted, feeling my cheeks flush with indignation. "I am not some doddering old fool who talks to imaginary friends." "No one is saying you're a fool," Jessica interjected quickly, always the peacemaker. "But maybe we should consider having Dr. Martinez run some additional tests, just to be safe." Margaret nodded, already shifting into her take-charge mode. "I think that's an excellent idea. In fact, I think we need to have a more comprehensive conversation about Mom's living situation and her ability to manage her affairs independently." The words hit me like a physical blow. My own children were discussing my competency as if I weren't sitting right there with them. They were planning to have me evaluated, questioned, possibly declared unfit to make my own decisions. All because I'd mentioned having coffee with Vincent. "You want to have me declared incompetent? I said quietly, the realization settling over me like a cold blanket. You want to take away my independence because I have a financial advisor you've never met. We want to make sure you're safe and cared for, Margaret corrected. But her lawyer's training couldn't completely hide the steel beneath her diplomatic words. If you're having conversations with people who don't exist, if you believe you have financial assets that aren't real, then yes, we need to take steps to protect you from yourself. Robert nodded solemnly. Mom, we love you. Everything we're suggesting comes from a place of love and concern. But you have to understand how this sounds from our perspective. I looked around the table at my children, these adults I'd raised, and sacrificed for and loved unconditionally. They were looking at me with pity, with concern, with the kind of patronizing patience reserved for small children and the mentally impaired. Not one of them considered the possibility that I might be telling the truth. You'll meet him, I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet certainty that seemed to surprise them. Vincent Chen is as real as any of you sitting at this table. And when you do meet him, I hope you'll remember this conversation and how quickly you were willing to dismiss your mother's word. Margaret's expression hardened. Mom, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. We're going to schedule an appointment with Dr. Martinez for next week. We're also going to look into some nice assisted living facilities, places where you can have independence but also have support when you need it. I don't need support, I said, standing from the table with as much dignity as I could muster. I need my family to trust me and respect me enough to believe what I'm telling them. Jessica reached for my hand. Mom, we do respect you, but you have to understand. No, I interrupted, pulling my hand away. You don't understand. You've already made up your minds. You've decided that your elderly mother has lost her grip on reality, and nothing I say will change that. I began clearing the dishes, a task that had been mine for so many years it felt automatic. My children sat in uncomfortable silence, clearly struggling with how to handle a situation that had escalated beyond their expectations. Vincent will be at the park tomorrow morning, as he is every Tuesday, I said without looking at them. If any of you cared enough to actually verify what I'm telling you instead of simply assuming I'm delusional, you could come with me and meet him yourself. Mom, Robert started, but I cut him off. But you won't, because it's easier to believe your mother is losing her mind than to consider that she might have parts of her life you don't know about. Margaret stood, her professional composure firmly in place. We'll discuss this more after you've had a chance to think about what we've said. I'm going to call Dr. Martinez first thing in the morning. You do that, I replied, scraping plates, with more force than necessary. But don't expect me to cooperate with your plans to warehouse me somewhere convenient. One by one, my children gathered their belongings and said their awkward goodbyes. Jessica lingered the longest, clearly torn between supporting her siblings and defending her mother. Finally, she kissed my cheek and whispered, I love you, Mom. We all do. We just want what's best for you. After they left, I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a pleasant family dinner. The house felt enormous and empty, filled with the echoes of a conversation that had changed everything between us. But as I finished cleaning up, I found myself smiling slightly. Tomorrow was Tuesday, and Vincent would be at the park as he always was. My children thought they knew everything about my life, about my capabilities, about my mental state. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. I had been Dolores Baker, devoted wife and mother for most of my adult life. I had put my family's needs before my own, made their problems my problems, and defined myself through their successes and failures. But Harold had been gone for 3 years now, and my children were adults with their own lives and their own families. It was time for them to discover who Dolly Baker really was when she wasn't busy being their mother. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of October day that made you grateful to be alive. I dressed carefully in my favorite navy dress and my comfortable walking shoes, then made my way to Central Park as I had every Tuesday for the past 14 months. Vincent was already waiting by the fountain when I arrived, immaculate as always in his tailored suit and polished shoes. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his kind eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He stood when he saw me approaching, a gesture of respect that my own children seemed to have forgotten. "Good morning, Dolly," he said warmly, using the name that made me feel like myself rather than just someone's mother. "You look troubled today. Is everything all right?" As we settled onto our usual bench, I told him about the previous evening's dinner conversation. Vincent listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I described my children's reaction to learning about him. "They think you're imaginary," I concluded with a bitter laugh. "They want to have me declared incompetent and put in assisted living because I mentioned having a financial advisor." Vincent was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded carefully in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Perhaps it's time," he said softly. "Perhaps it's time for them to know the truth about both of us." I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "Dolly, we've been dancing around certain realities for over a year now. Your children's reaction last night proves that we can't continue indefinitely with our current arrangement." "You're not imaginary," I said firmly. "You're sitting right here beside me." "Yes, I am, but there are things about me, about us, about your financial situation that your children don't understand. Things that would explain not just my existence, but why our relationship must remain discreet." I felt a flutter of something in my chest, part anticipation and part fear. "What are you suggesting?" Vincent reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "I'm suggesting that it's time for your family to meet Vincent Chen, and time for them to understand exactly who their mother really is." He opened the folder, revealing documents that made my breath catch in my throat. Portfolio statements, investment summaries, account balances that seemed impossibly large. Numbers that would silence my children's concerns about my mental competency once and for all. $1.2 billion, Vincent said quietly. "That's your current net worth, Dolly. Your children think you're living on Social Security and Harold's pension, barely making ends meet. They have no idea that you're one of the wealthiest women in the state." I stared at the papers, the reality of my situation hitting me with fresh force. For over a year, I'd been living a double life, meeting secretly with Vincent, watching my investments grow, all while allowing my children to believe I was just their aging mother struggling to maintain her independence. "They're going to have questions," I said slowly. "Questions about where the money came from, how long you've been managing it, why I kept it secret." Vincent's expression grew even more serious. "Yes, they will. And when they ask those questions, Dolly, I'll have to tell them the truth about who I am and why I've been helping you." "The truth?" He closed the folder and looked directly into my eyes. "The truth about why Vincent Chen cares so much about Dolores Baker's financial security. The truth about why I've been willing to meet secretly in parks instead of in professional offices. The truth about connections that go back much further than 14 months. My heart began to race. "Vincent, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Sunday dinner is about to become very interesting," he replied with a slight smile. "And your children are about to learn that their mother's imaginary friend is more real than they ever could have imagined." As I walked home from the park that morning, Vincent's words echoed in my mind. My children thought they were protecting me from my own delusions. They had no idea they were about to come face to face with a truth that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their mother, their family, and the power of love to endure across decades of separation and silence. The stage was set. The players were in position. And Dolly Baker was about to remind her children why underestimating her had always been a mistake. The call came at 7:30 Wednesday morning, jarring me from the peaceful silence of my morning coffee ritual. Margaret's voice cut through. The phone line with the efficiency of a surgical blade, all business despite the early hour. "Mother, I've scheduled your appointment with Dr. Martinez for Friday at 2 o'clock. I'll be picking you up at 1:15. No good morning, no asking how I slept, just the presumption that I would comply with plans made without consulting me. I stirred honey into my coffee and watched the golden swirls dissolve, much like my patience with my eldest daughter's high-handed approach to managing my life. "I haven't agreed to any appointment, Margaret. This isn't a negotiation. After last night's dinner, it's clear that we need professional guidance on how to proceed. Dr. Martinez specializes in geriatric cognitive assessment. He'll be able to determine whether your recent behaviors indicate the onset of dementia or if there are other underlying issues we need to address. Recent behaviors, as if having a financial advisor constituted aberrant conduct requiring medical intervention." I took a long sip of my coffee, savoring both, the warmth and the moment of silence before responding. "My behavior is perfectly normal for a woman who refuses to be treated like an incompetent child by her own offspring." Margaret's sigh carried clearly across the phone connection. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to help you. You're trying to control me. There's a significant difference." After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen and considered my options. My children had made their decision about my mental state based on a single mention of Vincent Chen. They were moving forward with their plans to have me evaluated, and depending on the results, potentially declared unfit to manage my own affairs. What they didn't understand was that I had been managing affairs far more complex than they could imagine. While they saw an aging widow struggling with the basics of daily life, Vincent and I had been building an investment portfolio that would ensure my independence for the rest of my days and leave a substantial legacy for future generations. The irony was almost amusing. They were worried about my ability to handle my own finances, while remaining completely oblivious to the fact that I had become wealthier than all of them combined. Thursday brought Robert to my doorstep, unannounced, and carrying a box of groceries that I neither needed nor requested. His presumption that I couldn't manage my own shopping was another small indignity in a growing collection of slights against my competence. "Just thought I'd check on you, Mom," he said, bustling into my kitchen and beginning to unpack items I would never have chosen for myself. Low sodium this, sugar-free that. Everything selected by someone who assumed I couldn't be trusted to make appropriate choices about my own nutrition. "I'm perfectly capable of buying my own groceries, Robert." "I know you are. But it's no trouble for Linda and me to pick up a few things when we're out. Besides, some of these specialty items are easier to find at the larger stores." Specialty items. As if my advancing age had rendered me incapable of digesting regular food. I watched him arrange cans in my pantry according to some organizational system that made sense only to him, and felt the familiar sting of being managed, rather than helped. "Have you given any more thought to what we discussed Tuesday night?" he asked, his back turned as he continued his uninvited reorganization of my kitchen. "You mean your plan to have me declared mentally incompetent? That's not what we're doing, and you know it. We're concerned about your well-being. This Vincent Chen person, Mom, these conversations you think you're having, they're not real. We need to understand what's causing these episodes so we can help you." Episodes. Another clinical term to describe my perfectly rational interactions with a legitimate financial professional. I considered telling Robert exactly how much money Vincent had helped me accumulate, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the revelation would be more powerful when delivered at the right moment, in front of all of them simultaneously. "You could meet him yourself if you really wanted to verify his existence." Robert turned to face me, his expression patient but patronizing. "Mom, I followed you to the park yesterday morning." The words hit me like cold water. "You what?" I was worried about you after Tuesday night. I wanted to see what was really happening during these supposed meetings with your financial advisor. Heat flooded my cheeks. You spied on me? I wouldn't call it spying. I was concerned. And Mom, what I saw confirmed our fears. You sat on that bench for over an hour talking to empty air, having animated conversations with no one. It was heartbreaking to watch. My mind raced, trying to process what Robert was telling me. Yesterday morning, Vincent and I had our usual Tuesday meeting. We'd discussed market volatility, reviewed quarterly projections, and planned strategy adjustments. Vincent had been as present and engaged as always, offering insights that had proven profitable over the months we'd worked together. That's impossible, I said slowly. Vincent was there. We talked for nearly 2 hours about my portfolio. Robert's face crumpled with sympathy, the expression one might reserve for a beloved pet that had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Mom, there was no one there. You were alone on that bench, talking and gesturing as if someone was sitting beside you. I stayed for the entire time, hoping someone would show up to explain what was happening. But it was just you, having a conversation with your imagination. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Robert's words challenged not just my perception of yesterday's events, but my entire understanding of my relationship with Vincent. Had I been delusional? Had months of meetings been elaborate fantasies created by a mind struggling with isolation and age? I'm not imagining Vincent Chen, I said, but my voice lacked the conviction I'd felt just moments before. I know you believe that, and that's what makes this so difficult. The mind can play tricks on us, especially as we get older. Sometimes we create relationships to fill voids in our lives. It doesn't mean you're crazy or that there's anything wrong with you as a person. It just means you need help. Robert's gentle tone somehow made his words more devastating than if he'd been harsh or dismissive. He genuinely believed he'd witnessed evidence of my deteriorating mental state. From his perspective, he'd seen his mother having an extended conversation with no one, confirming his worst fears about my cognitive decline. But I knew what I'd experienced. Vincent Chen was real, substantial, knowledgeable about financial markets in ways that my imagination could never have conjured. Our conversations contained information and insights that went far beyond anything I could have invented on my own. Unless they didn't. Unless my mind had been constructing elaborate fantasies based on fragments of financial news and half-remembered conversations from Harold's business dealings. Unless Robert was right, and I was losing the ability to distinguish between reality and wishful thinking. The doubt crept in like fog, obscuring certainties I'd taken for granted. By the time Robert left, carrying with him the satisfied air of someone who'd confirmed his suspicions, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about my weekly meetings in the park. That evening, Jessica called with a gentleness that somehow felt more patronizing than Margaret's direct approach or Robert's concerned observations. Mom, I've been thinking about what happened at dinner, and I want you to know that I love you no matter what we're dealing with. What we're dealing with, I repeated. You mean my supposed dementia. I mean whatever challenges you're facing. Robert told me about yesterday morning, about what he saw at the park. I know this must be confusing and frightening for you. Confusing was an understatement. Frightening was closer to the truth. The possibility that my mind was creating elaborate fantasies terrified me more than any physical ailment I could imagine. If I couldn't trust my own perceptions, if my memories of conversations and interactions were fabrications, then what else might be false? Jessica, I need you to be honest with me. Have I mentioned Vincent Chen before Tuesday night? There was a pause. No, Mom. Tuesday was the first time any of us had heard that name. But I've been meeting with him for over a year. Surely I must have mentioned him in passing, talked about our conversations, referenced his advice. You haven't. We would have remembered if you'd talked about having a financial advisor. It's not the kind of thing we would have forgotten." Her words carried the weight of certainty, the collective memory of 3 adult children who paid attention to their mother's activities and concerns. If I had truly been meeting with Vincent Chen for 14 months, wouldn't I have mentioned him to my family? Wouldn't there have been some reference to his guidance, some acknowledgement of his role in my financial planning? The absence of any prior mention seemed to support their theory that Vincent was a recent creation of my aging mind, a fantasy companion invented to fill the loneliness left by Harold's death. "The appointment with Dr. Martinez will help us understand what's happening," Jessica continued. "There are treatments available now, medications that can slow the progression of cognitive decline. The important thing is that we're catching this early." After the call ended, I sat in Harold's old chair and tried to sort through my memories of meeting Vincent. I could recall our conversations with perfect clarity, remember his insights and recommendations, visualize his appearance and mannerisms. But memory, I was learning, could be an unreliable narrator. Friday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Margaret picked me up precisely at 1:15. Her punctuality a point of pride that I'd once found admirable but now experienced as another form of control. She chattered nervously during the drive to Dr. Martinez's office, filling the silence with updates about her work and observations about the weather. Dr. Martinez was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in his early 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. His office was decorated with family photos and children's drawings, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a favorite uncle's study than a clinical examination room. "Mrs. Baker, I understand your family has some concerns about recent changes in your behavior. They think I'm having conversations with imaginary people. And what do you think?" The question surprised me. I'd expected him to begin with assumptions about my mental state, to approach our conversation through the lens of suspected dementia. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on the situation. "I think my children are having difficulty accepting that their mother might have aspects of her life they don't know about." Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me about Vincent Chen." So I did. I described our weekly meetings, our discussions about market trends and investment strategies, his professional demeanor and obvious expertise. Dr. Martinez listened, without interruption, occasionally taking notes but never displaying the skeptical expression I'd grown accustomed to seeing from my family. "These conversations you have with Mr. Chen, do they feel real to you?" "Completely real, as real as this conversation we're having now." "And the investment advice he gives you, does it seem knowledgeable and appropriate?" "Extraordinarily so. Vincent understands market dynamics in ways that have impressed me consistently over the months we've worked together." Dr. Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Baker, I'm going to ask you to undergo some cognitive assessments, but I want you to know that your responses today don't suggest obvious signs of dementia or other serious cognitive impairment. Your speech is clear, your thought processes are logical, and your memory appears intact." Relief flooded through me. "Then you don't think I'm losing my mind?" "I think the human brain is remarkably complex, and our understanding of how it processes social connections and relationships is still evolving. The fact that your family can't verify Mr. Chen's existence is concerning from their perspective, but it doesn't necessarily indicate cognitive decline." The assessment tests that followed were more extensive than I'd anticipated. Dr. Martinez evaluated my memory, problem-solving abilities, spatial awareness, and language skills. Some tasks were simple, like remembering word lists or identifying objects in photographs. Others required more complex reasoning, such as solving mathematical problems or explaining the relationships between abstract concepts. Throughout the testing, I found myself performing well, my mind sharp and focused despite the emotional strain of the past few days. When we finished, Dr. Martinez reviewed his notes with an expression that seemed almost puzzled. Mrs. Baker, your cognitive function tests within normal ranges for your age group. Your memory is excellent. Your reasoning skills are intact, and you show no signs of the confusion or disorientation typically associated with dementia. Then why can't my family see Vincent? That's a question I can't answer definitively. There are documented cases of individuals who report interactions with people that others cannot perceive, but who show no other signs of mental illness or cognitive impairment. Sometimes these experiences serve important psychological functions, providing companionship or guidance during difficult periods. Dr. Martinez's explanation offered some comfort, but it also left room for doubt. Was Vincent real, or wasn't he? The question seemed to exist in a gray area between medical certainty and psychological mystery. What will you tell my family? I'll tell them that your cognitive abilities appear normal for your age, and that any decisions about your independence should be based on your actual functional capacity rather than concerns about specific behaviors that may have explanations we don't fully understand. When Margaret and I left Dr. Martinez's office, her satisfaction was evident. She'd gotten professional validation that her mother required monitoring and concern, even if the doctor hadn't provided the clear diagnosis of dementia she might have expected. At least now we know what we're dealing with, she said as we drove back to my house. What exactly do you think we're dealing with? Early-stage cognitive changes that are affecting your perception of reality. Dr. Martinez was diplomatic about it, but the implication was clear. You're having experiences that feel real to you, but don't correspond to objective reality. I didn't argue. Margaret had heard what she needed to hear to justify her concerns and her plans for managing my care. She hadn't absorbed Dr. Martinez's emphasis on my normal cognitive function or his suggestion that my experiences might have explanations beyond mental deterioration. That evening, alone in my house, I made a decision that would either prove my sanity or confirm my family's worst fears. I called Vincent Chen. His number was programmed into my phone, as it had been for months. If he was imaginary, if our relationship existed only in my deteriorating mind, then the call would go nowhere. There would be no answer, no voicemail, no evidence of his existence outside my delusions. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered. "Hello, Dolly. I was hoping you'd call." The relief that washed over me was so intense it left me momentarily speechless. Vincent was real. His voice was clear and distinct, not the product of my imagination, but the actual sound of a living person speaking through a telephone connection. "Vincent, I need to see you. Something has happened, and I need to know that you're really there." "Of course, but not at the park this time. Your family is watching you too closely. Can you meet me at the Riverside Cafe tomorrow at 10 o'clock? It's public enough to be safe, but private enough for us to talk freely." The Riverside Cafe was a small establishment I'd never visited, located on the other side of town from my usual haunts. If Vincent was a figment of my imagination, how would I know about a place I'd never been? How would my mind conjure specific details about its location and atmosphere? Saturday morning found me driving across town with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. If Vincent was there, if he was real and substantial and could be seen by others, then my family's concerns were unfounded. If he wasn't, if I found myself sitting alone at a cafe table having conversations with empty air, then perhaps it was time to accept the possibility that my mind was playing elaborate tricks on me. The Riverside Cafe was exactly as I'd somehow expected it to be, a cozy spot with mismatched furniture and local artwork covering the walls. Vincent was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, his silver hair catching the morning light. Streaming through the windows, he stood when he saw me, his smile warm and genuine. The waitress looked directly at him when she approached our table, took his order for black coffee without any sign that she was interacting with someone who didn't exist. Other patrons glanced in our direction occasionally, their casual attention, confirming that they saw two people having a conversation rather than one elderly woman talking to herself. "You look troubled, Dolly. Tell me what's been happening." I explained the events of the past few days, my family's concerns, Robert's claims about following me to the park, the appointment with Dr. Martinez. Vincent listened intently, his expression growing more serious as I described their plans to potentially have me declared incompetent. "They followed you to our meeting?" According to Robert, he watched me sit alone on the bench for 2 hours, talking to no one. Vincent's face darkened. "That's impossible." "I was there, Dolly. We had our usual discussion about your portfolio adjustments. I remember every detail of our conversation." "Then how do you explain what Robert claims he saw?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "There are things about me, about our relationship, that I haven't explained fully. Circumstances that make it necessary for me to be very careful about when and how I make myself visible to others." "What kind of circumstances?" "The kind that require a level of trust and discretion that goes beyond normal professional relationships. Dolly, your family's reaction to learning about me suggests that it's time for complete honesty between us." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew the same folder he'd shown me briefly at the park. This time, he opened it completely, spreading documents across our small table. Bank statements, investment portfolios, account summaries showing numbers that made my breath catch in my throat. "Your current net worth is $1.4 billion, Vincent said quietly. "Your children think you're living on Social Security and Harold's pension. They have no idea that over the past 14 months, we've built an investment portfolio that makes you one of the wealthiest women in the region." I stared at the documents, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The numbers were real, printed on official letterhead from prestigious financial institutions. Account balances that dwarfed anything I could have imagined. How is this possible? I never had this kind of money to invest. "You did, Dolly. You just didn't know. Harold left you far more than the modest inheritance your children are aware of. There were accounts, investments, assets that he kept private even from you during his lifetime. When he died, those assets transferred to you, but the documentation was complex enough that they remained hidden until I helped you locate and consolidate them." The revelation left me reeling. Harold had been a successful businessman, but I'd never imagined he'd accumulated wealth on this scale. Our lifestyle had been comfortable but modest, our expenses reasonable and well within our apparent means. Why didn't he tell me? Harold was a very private man when it came to financial matters. He wanted to ensure your security without burdening you with the complexities of managing substantial wealth. The arrangements he made were designed to activate after his death, providing you with the resources you'd need while maintaining the privacy he valued. Vincent's explanation made sense, but it raised new questions about the nature of his relationship with my family's finances. How did you know about Harold's arrangements? How did you find me? That's where the story becomes more complicated. Dolly, and it's why your children's desire to meet me presents certain challenges that go beyond simple professional discretion. The way he said it sent a chill through me. There was something in Vincent's tone, a hesitation that suggested we were approaching territory that would change everything I thought I understood about our relationship. "What aren't you telling me, Vincent?" He closed the folder and leaned forward, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "I'm telling you that your family is about to learn truths that will challenge everything they believe about their past, their mother, and the nature of love and loyalty. I don't understand. You will, Dolly. Tomorrow, when I come to Sunday dinner as your guest, you'll understand everything, and so will they." The certainty in his voice both thrilled and terrified me. Whatever Vincent was planning to reveal would vindicate my claims about his existence, while simultaneously exposing secrets that had been hidden for decades. As I drove home from the cafe, my mind churned with questions and possibilities. The documents I'd seen proved that my financial situation was far more complex than anyone realized. Vincent's management of my assets had been expert and profitable, generating returns that would ensure my independence for the rest of my life. But his hints about deeper connections, about truths that would shock my family, suggested that our relationship encompassed far more than professional financial advice. There were layers to this story that I hadn't yet uncovered, revelations that would explain not just Vincent's existence, but his motivation for helping me. Sunday dinner would change everything. My children would finally meet the man they'd dismissed as imaginary, see the evidence of wealth they'd never suspected, and learn truths about their family that had been carefully guarded for reasons I was only beginning to understand. As I prepared for what promised to be the most significant family gathering in years, I found myself both excited and apprehensive about what Vincent's revelations would mean for all of us. The game of hiding and pretending was about to end, replaced by a reality that none of us were fully prepared to confront. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes ordinary moments feel significant. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the maple tree in my backyard shed its final autumn leaves, and felt the weight of impending change settling around me like the season itself. Vincent had promised to arrive at 4 o'clock, precisely when my family would be gathering for our traditional Sunday dinner. The timing was deliberate, calculated to maximize the impact of his appearance. My children expected to find their confused mother setting a place at the table for an imaginary guest. Instead, they would encounter a reality that would shatter every assumption they'd made about my mental state and my circumstances. I spent the morning cooking with more care than I'd invested in a meal for years. Prime rib roast, roasted vegetables, with herbs from my garden, fresh dinner rolls that filled the house with the scent of yeast and butter. If this was to be a day of revelations, I wanted it accompanied by a feast worthy of the occasion. Margaret called at noon, her voice carrying the cautious tone she'd adopted since our confrontation earlier in the week. "Mom, Robert mentioned that you invited someone to dinner today. Are you feeling all right?" "I feel perfectly fine, Margaret. And yes, I've invited Vincent Chen to join us. I thought it was time you all met him." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to imagine Margaret's expression, the mixture of concern and frustration that had become her default response to my behavior. "Mother, we've discussed this. There is no Vincent Chen. Please, don't make this harder on yourself by continuing to insist that your imaginary friend will be joining us for dinner. He'll be here at 4 o'clock. I suggest you prepare yourselves to be surprised." I'm calling Dr. Martinez first thing Monday morning. This delusion is becoming more elaborate, and I think we need to consider more intensive intervention. After hanging up, I continued my meal preparations with the satisfaction of someone who knew she was about to prove a significant point. My children had made their judgments based on limited information and their own preconceptions about aging and mental decline. They were about to learn the dangers of underestimating Dolores Baker. Jessica arrived first, as she usually did, bringing her twins and her perpetual aura of gentle concern. She hugged me with the careful tenderness reserved for fragile things, her eyes scanning my face for signs of deterioration. "How are you feeling today, Mom? Are you still planning to have dinner with your friend?" "Vincent will be here shortly. I think you'll find him quite charming." Jessica's smile was patient and sad. "Mom, I know you believe that, but we're here to support you no matter what happens. If your friend doesn't arrive, that's okay. We love you regardless." Her kindness was almost harder to bear than Margaret's directness or Robert's clinical observations. Jessica's pity carried the weight of genuine affection, making her inability to trust my word even more painful. Robert arrived with his wife, Linda, both of them wearing expressions of determined cheerfulness that couldn't quite mask their underlying anxiety. Linda had brought a covered dish despite my protests that I'd prepared everything we needed, her contribution a not-so-subtle suggestion that I might be losing my ability to manage a complete meal. "Something smells wonderful in here," Linda said brightly, kissing my cheek with practiced warmth. "You've been busy today." I wanted everything to be perfect for when Vincent arrives. Robert and Linda exchanged one of those married couple glances that communicated volumes without words. They'd clearly discussed how to handle their mother-in-law's deteriorating grip on reality, settling on a strategy of supportive but watchful patience. Margaret arrived precisely at 3:30, her punctuality a point of pride that had shaped family gatherings for decades. She carried herself with the bearing of someone prepared for difficult conversations, her lawyer's training evident in the way she assessed the scene before committing to any particular approach. "Everything looks lovely, Mom," she said, surveying the dining room table set for 6 people. Her gaze lingered on the extra place setting, the wine glass and carefully folded napkin positioned for Vincent's arrival. "Thank you. I think Vincent will appreciate the effort. Mom, before anyone else arrives, I think we should talk about what's going to happen when 4 o'clock comes and no one shows up for dinner." I was arranging flowers in the centerpiece, my hands steady despite the emotional undercurrent of the conversation. "What's going to happen is that you'll meet Vincent Chen and realize that your mother isn't losing her mind." Margaret's expression softened with the kind of sympathy typically reserved for terminal diagnoses. "And if that doesn't happen? If 4 o'clock comes and goes without any guest arriving, will you consider the possibility that Vincent exists only in your imagination?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that extended far beyond a single dinner invitation. Margaret was asking me to accept that my perception of reality was fundamentally flawed, that months of conversations and professional guidance had been elaborate fantasies created by a deteriorating mind. "Vincent will be here," I said simply, my voice carrying a conviction that surprised even me. By 3:45, my entire family had assembled in the living room, making conversation with the forced casualness of people waiting for a disaster to unfold. Jessica's twins played quietly in the corner, their usual energy subdued by the adult tension they couldn't understand but clearly sensed. Robert and Linda discussed local news with manufactured enthusiasm, while Margaret reviewed something on her phone, probably researching assisted living facilities or consulting with colleagues about guardianship procedures. I excused myself to check on the roast, though my real purpose was to escape the suffocating atmosphere of collective pity that had settled over my house. In the kitchen, I basted the meat and adjusted the oven temperature, normal actions that helped ground me in the reality of my own competence. At 3:58, I heard a car door close in my driveway. The sound carried through the house like a gunshot, immediately silencing all conversation in the living room. I could picture my children's expressions, the dawning realization that someone had actually arrived for dinner. For a moment, they would hope that I'd invited a neighbor or family friend without mentioning it, some perfectly reasonable explanation for the unexpected guest. The doorbell rang at exactly 4 o'clock. I smoothed my dress and walked to the front door with measured steps, savoring the moment before everything changed. Behind me, I could hear whispered conversations, my children debating who should answer, the door and how to handle whatever scenario was about to unfold. Vincent Chen stood on my front porch looking exactly as he always did, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a silk tie that caught the afternoon light. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his posture erect and confident. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a bouquet of white roses in the other. "Good afternoon, Dolly," he said with the warm smile I'd come to associate with our Tuesday meetings. "I hope I'm not too early." "Your timing is perfect, Vincent. Please come in." I led him into the living room where my family sat frozen in various stages of shock. Margaret had risen from her chair but seemed unable to move further. Robert's mouth was slightly open, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the beginning of embarrassment. Jessica stared at Vincent, as if he might disappear if she blinked, her hands clutched together in her lap. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Vincent Chen," I said with the satisfaction of someone who had just won a significant victory. "Vincent, these are my children, Margaret, Robert, and Jessica, along with Robert's wife Linda and Jessica's twins, Michael and Sarah." Vincent stepped forward with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in social situations, extending his hand first to Margaret, who shook it with the automatic politeness drilled into her by years of professional networking. "Ms. Baker, I've heard so much about you from your mother. She's very proud of your success in the legal profession." Margaret's response was barely audible, her lawyer's composure shattered by the simple fact of Vincent's existence. "Thank you. We weren't sure." "You weren't sure I was real," Vincent finished gently, his tone carrying no judgment or criticism. "Your mother mentioned that there had been some confusion about our professional relationship." Robert stood abruptly, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I followed her to the park. I watched her talking to no one for 2 hours. Vincent's expression grew thoughtful. "Ah, that explains the miscommunication. Tuesday mornings can be challenging for visibility, especially from a distance. The morning fog combined with the positioning of the benches makes it difficult to see clearly from the parking area." "What exactly do you mean by visibility?" Margaret asked, her lawyer's instincts beginning to override her shock. "I mean that there are aspects of my work that require a certain level of discretion. Not everyone can see me at all times, and the circumstances under which I become visible to others are somewhat complicated." The room fell silent as my family tried to process Vincent's words. His explanation raised more questions than it answered, hinting at complexities that went beyond simple professional relationships. Linda spoke for the first time since Vincent's arrival, her voice uncertain. "Are you saying that you can control whether people can see you?" Vincent smiled, but there was something enigmatic in his expression. "I'm saying that my relationship with your mother-in-law involves circumstances that most people would find difficult to understand or accept." Jessica leaned forward, her protective instincts engaged despite her confusion. "What kind of circumstances? What exactly is your relationship with our mother?" "I'm her financial advisor," Vincent replied simply, "and I've been helping her manage assets that have generated substantial returns over the past 14 months. Margaret's professional skepticism reasserted itself. "What kind of assets? Mom lives on Social Security and Dad's pension. There aren't any significant assets to manage." Vincent opened his briefcase and withdrew the same folder he'd shown me at the cafe. He spread documents across my coffee table with the same care he'd used in our private meeting, bank statements and investment summaries that would forever change my children's understanding of our family's financial situation. "Your mother's current net worth is approximately $1.4 billion, Vincent said quietly. "These documents represent her investment portfolio, which I've been managing since shortly after your father's death." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Jessica's twins seemed to sense the magnitude of the moment, their quiet play, stopping as they observed the adults' stunned expressions. Margaret was the first to recover, reaching for the documents with hands that trembled slightly. She examined the papers with the thoroughness of someone trained to spot financial irregularities, her expression growing more incredulous with each page. "These accounts, these institutions, they're all legitimate," she said slowly. "But how? Is this possible? Where did this money come from?" Vincent glanced at me, seeking permission to continue. I nodded, ready for my children to learn the truth about their father's business dealings and the inheritance he'd left carefully hidden. "Your father was far more successful than he allowed anyone to know," Vincent explained. "Harold Baker maintained separate investment accounts, real estate holdings, and business interests that he kept private even from your mother during his lifetime. The documentation was complex, designed to transfer these assets to Dolly after his death while maintaining the secrecy he valued. Robert sank back into his chair, his face pale. Dad was worth over $1 billion? That's impossible. We lived in this house, drove ordinary cars, took modest vacations. There was never any indication of that kind of wealth. Harold believed indiscretion, Vincent continued. He wanted to ensure your mother's security without changing the family dynamics that had served you all so well. The arrangements he made were designed to activate after his death, providing Dolly with the resources she would need while maintaining her ability to live as she chose. Linda spoke up, her practical nature asserting itself. But if this money existed, why didn't it show up in the estate proceedings? How could assets of this magnitude remain hidden during probate? The estate that went through probate represented only a small fraction of Harold's total wealth, Vincent explained. The majority of his assets were held in trusts and investment, vehicles that transferred directly to your mother outside the normal probate process. Margaret was still studying the documents, her legal training helping her navigate the complex financial structures outlined in the papers. These trust arrangements, they're incredibly sophisticated. Dad would have needed expert legal and financial advice to set up something this elaborate. He did, Vincent said simply. Harold worked with a very select group of advisors who specialized in maintaining privacy for high-net-worth individuals. And you were one of those advisors? Jessica asked. Vincent hesitated for the first time since his arrival, his confidence wavering slightly. My relationship with your family goes back much further than 14 months, though the nature of that relationship is somewhat complicated to explain. The way he said it sent a chill through the room. There was something in Vincent's tone that suggested we were approaching revelations that would dwarf even the shock of learning about my hidden wealth. What do you mean it goes back further? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Vincent closed the financial documents and looked directly at me, his expression carrying a weight of emotion that transformed his features. The professional composure he'd maintained throughout the evening cracked slightly, revealing something deeper and more personal underneath. Dolly, there are things about me, about my connection to your family, that I've never told you. Things that explain not just why I've been so committed to protecting your financial security, but why I've been willing to meet secretly rather than working through normal professional channels. Margaret stood up, her lawyer's instincts sensing that we were approaching something significant. Mr. Chen, I think you need to be completely transparent about your relationship with our family. You're right, Vincent replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Complete transparency is exactly what this situation requires. He reached into his briefcase again, this time withdrawing a different folder, one that looked older and more worn than the financial documents. The papers inside were yellowed with age, some handwritten, others bearing official stamps and seals. These documents will explain everything, Vincent said, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the folder. But I want you to understand that what I'm about to show you will challenge everything you believe about your family's history. Jessica moved closer to me, her protective instincts engaged despite her confusion about what was happening. Mom, are you sure you want to hear this? I looked around the room at my children, these adults I'd raised and loved and protected for decades. They'd spent the past week questioning my sanity, planning to have me declared incompetent, assuming that their aging mother was losing her grip on reality. Now they were faced with evidence that not only was I competent, but I was wealthier than they'd ever imagined. But Vincent's demeanor suggested that we hadn't yet reached the most significant revelation of the evening. Whatever he was preparing to tell us would explain the mystery of his relationship with our family, while potentially exposing secrets that had been hidden for reasons I was only beginning to understand. Yes, I said firmly. I want to know everything. Vincent nodded and withdrew a photograph from the folder, one that made my breath catch in my throat. It was old, probably from the 1970s, showing a young Asian man in military uniform standing beside Harold, in what appeared to be a foreign setting. This photograph was taken in Vietnam in 1972, Vincent said quietly. The young man standing next to your father is me. The room erupted in confusion and disbelief. Robert stood up abruptly, his voice sharp with incredulity. That's impossible. You'd have to be in your 70s, maybe even 80 years old. You don't look a day over 50. Vincent smiled sadly. I'm 73 years old, Robert. And the reason I don't look my age is part of what makes my story so difficult to believe. Margaret grabbed the photograph, studying it with intense scrutiny. This could be doctored. Photo manipulation technology makes it possible to create convincing fake images. It could be, Vincent agreed, but it's not. That photograph is genuine, taken by a fellow soldier who died 3 weeks later in an ambush outside Saigon. Jessica was staring at Vincent as if seeing him for the first time. You knew our father in Vietnam? But he never mentioned having close friends from the war. He rarely talked about his service at all. Harold rarely talked about Vietnam because his experiences there were traumatic in ways that went beyond normal combat stress, Vincent explained. What happened to us during those final months of the war changed both of our lives in ways that neither of us fully understood at the time. I felt something cold settling in my stomach. Harold had indeed been reluctant to discuss his military service, dismissing my questions with vague references to the difficulty of war and his desire to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. I'd respected his privacy, but now I wondered what secrets he'd been protecting. What happened to you in Vietnam? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was prepared for the answer. Vincent looked at me with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something that might have been relief. What happened was that your husband saved my life in a way that created a debt I've been trying to repay for over 50 years. He withdrew more documents from the folder, spreading them across the table alongside the financial papers, military records, medical reports, and what appeared to be official government correspondence dating back decades. In March of 1973, our unit was pinned down by enemy fire for 3 days. Vincent continued, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving traumatic memories. I was severely wounded, bleeding badly, and Harold risked his own life to carry me to safety. But the evacuation helicopter was hit by enemy fire, and we crashed in territory controlled by North Vietnamese forces. Margaret was reading the military documents, her expression growing more serious as she absorbed the information. According to these records, both of you were declared missing in action, then presumed dead when no trace of your unit could be found. That's correct, Vincent said. Officially, both Harold Baker and Vincent Chen died in Vietnam in March of 1973. The implications of his words hit the room like a physical blow. If both men had been declared dead, then how was Harold able to return home, marry me, and raise a family? And how was Vincent sitting in my living room 5 decades later? But Dad came home, Robert said slowly, his voice carrying a note of desperation. He married Mom, had a family, built a life here. You can't be dead and still have a normal civilian life. Vincent's smile was infinitely sad. Harold did come home eventually, but the man who returned from Vietnam wasn't exactly the same person, who'd left for war 3 years earlier. Jessica moved closer to me, her protective instincts fully engaged. What are you saying? That our father was somehow changed by what happened to him? I'm saying that the experience we shared created circumstances that bound your father and me together in ways that neither of us fully understood, Vincent replied. Harold came home, but he carried with him a responsibility for my welfare that shaped every major decision he made for the rest of his life. I stared at Vincent, trying to reconcile the man sitting in my living room with the photograph of the young soldier who had supposedly died alongside my husband 50 years ago. The physical resemblance was undeniable, but the implications of his story challenged everything I thought I knew about Harold's past and our family's history. You're saying that you've been alive all this time? I asked. That Harold knew you survived Vietnam but never told anyone? Harold knew I survived because he was responsible for my survival, Vincent said quietly. What happened to us in that jungle created a bond that transcended normal human relationships. Your husband spent the rest of his life honoring that bond, even though it meant keeping secrets from the people he loved most. Margaret was frantically shuffling through the documents, her legal training helping her identify patterns and connections that might explain Vincent's incredible story. These medical records, they're from military hospitals, but the dates don't make sense. Some of these treatments were administered years after you were supposedly declared dead. The treatments were necessary because what happened to me in Vietnam had long-term consequences that required ongoing medical care, Vincent explained. Harold arranged for that care, funded it, and made sure I had access to the best specialists available, all while maintaining the fiction that Vincent Chen had died in 1973. Robert was pacing now, his agitation evident in every movement. Why? Why would Dad go to such elaborate lengths to help someone who was officially dead? What was so special about your relationship that it justified decades of secrecy? Vincent looked at each of my children in turn, his expression carrying the weight of someone about to reveal a truth that would change everything. Because Harold Baker didn't just save my life in Vietnam. He gave me his life, in the most literal sense possible. The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent's words hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself, impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to accept without fundamentally restructuring our understanding of the past. I don't understand, Jessica said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent reached into the folder one final time, withdrawing a document that made my hands tremble when I saw it. It was a death certificate, official and stamped, bearing Harold's name and a date in March of 1973. This is your father's death certificate, Vincent said gently. Harold Baker died in that helicopter crash in Vietnam, just as the official records indicate. But through circumstances that I'm still struggling to understand myself, his life force, his essence, his soul, if you believe in such things, somehow merged with mine during those final moments. Margaret grabbed the death certificate, studying it with the intensity of someone searching for evidence of fraud. But the document appeared genuine, bearing all the official seals and signatures that would be expected from military records of that era. You're claiming that our father's soul merged with yours? She asked, her voice rising with incredulity. That's not possible. That's not how death works. I'm claiming that something happened in that jungle that science can't explain and that I've spent 50 years trying to understand, Vincent replied. All I know for certain is that Harold Baker died saving my life, and that something of him has lived on within me ever since. I felt the room spinning around me, the implications of Vincent's revelation too massive to fully comprehend. If he was telling the truth, then the man I'd married, the father of my children, had died decades before I'd ever met him. The life we'd built together, the love we'd shared, the family we'd created, had all been built on the foundation of an impossible mystery. The Harold who came home from Vietnam, I said slowly. Was that you? Vincent's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. I came home carrying Harold's memories, his personality, his love for the family he'd left behind. I tried to live his life, the way he would have wanted it lived, to be the husband and father he would have been if he'd survived. Jessica was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process what Vincent was telling us. So our father, the man who raised us, who loved us, who was there for every birthday and graduation and wedding, that was you? That was me trying to honor Harold's memory by living the life he couldn't live himself, Vincent confirmed. And for 37 years, I tried to be worthy of the love you gave to the man you thought was your father. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Jessica's quiet sobbing. My children were struggling to reconcile their memories of Harold with the impossible story Vincent was telling us. The man they'd known as their father had been loving, present, dedicated to his family's welfare. But according to Vincent, that man had been living a life that wasn't originally his own. "Why are you telling us this now?" Robert asked, his voice hollow with shock. Vincent looked at me with an expression of infinite tenderness. "Because Dolly deserves to know the truth about the man she loved. And because I'm dying." The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping for breath. Vincent was dying, which meant that whatever remained of Harold within him would die as well. I would lose my husband a second time, in a way that was even more final than his original death. "How long do you have?" I whispered. "Months, perhaps. A year if I'm fortunate." The connection that allowed me to carry Harold's essence for so long is finally breaking down. My body can no longer sustain the dual existence that has defined my life for half a century. Margaret was still studying the documents, but her professional skepticism was warring with the emotional impact of Vincent's story. "Even if what you're saying is true, even if some part of our father has been living within you all these years, why maintain the deception for so long? Why not tell us the truth years ago?" "Because Harold's greatest fear was that his family would suffer if they learned the circumstances of his survival," Vincent explained. "He was terrified that you would reject him if you knew that the man you loved wasn't entirely human in the conventional sense. So instead, you let us believe he died 3 years ago?" Jessica asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I let you grieve for a man who had actually died decades earlier, yes. But I also gave you 37 years with a father who loved you. Completely, even if that love came from an impossible source." I reached across the space between us and took Vincent's hand in mine. His skin was warm, real, undeniably human. But now I understood why there had always been something indefinable about Harold, some quality that set him apart from other men. It hadn't been just his kindness or his intelligence or his devotion to our family. It had been the presence of two souls sharing one existence, two men's love concentrated into a single lifetime. "The money," I said suddenly, understanding flooding through me. Harold's hidden wealth, the investments, the elaborate financial arrangements. That was all preparation for this moment, wasn't it? For when you would finally have to tell us the truth. Vincent nodded. Harold knew that eventually the connection between us would weaken. He spent decades building a financial foundation that would ensure your security long after both of us were gone. The billion-dollar portfolio isn't just an inheritance, Dolly. It's Harold's final expression of love for the family he was able to cherish through borrowed time. As the full scope of Vincent's revelations settled over us, I realized that my children's concerns about my mental state had been tragically ironic. They'd been worried that I was losing touch with reality while I was actually discovering truths about our family that were more extraordinary than any fantasy my aging mind could have conceived. Vincent Chen was real, but he was also Harold Baker in ways that challenged every assumption about life, death, and the nature of human existence. My financial advisor was my deceased husband. My imaginary friend was the man who had raised my children, and my family was about to grapple with a love story that transcended the boundaries of mortality itself. The Sunday dinner I'd prepared with such care sat cooling in the kitchen, forgotten in the face of revelations that would reshape our understanding of everything we thought we knew about ourselves and each other. The grandfather clock in my hallway chimed 6 times, its deep tones cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over my living room like a shroud. Vincent's revelation about Harold's death and his own impossible existence had left my family suspended in a state of collective shock, each of them struggling to process information that challenged the very foundation of their understanding about life and death. Margaret remained standing, her lawyer's posture rigid as she clutched the military documents that Vincent had spread across my coffee table. Her professional training had taught her to analyze evidence methodically, but the papers in her hands defied logical explanation. Death certificates bearing her father's name, medical records spanning decades, financial documents that traced the careful construction of a $1 billion legacy, all pointing to a truth that seemed to exist outside the realm of possibility. "I need to understand the mechanics of what you're claiming," she said finally, her voice carrying the controlled tone she used when cross-examining difficult witnesses. "You're telling us that our father's consciousness, his personality, his memories, somehow transferred into your body at the moment of his death?" Vincent shifted in his chair, and for the first time since his arrival, I noticed signs of the physical strain he'd mentioned. His breathing seemed slightly labored, and there was a pallor beneath his composed exterior that spoke of declining health. Whatever supernatural connection had sustained him for 5 decades was clearly beginning to weaken. "I'm telling you, what I experienced, what I've lived with for 50 years, he replied carefully. "In that helicopter, as Harold was dying from his wounds, something passed between us. I felt his memories flooding into my mind, his emotions becoming mine, his love for the family he was leaving behind taking root in my heart." Robert had moved to the window, staring out at the darkening street as if the familiar view might help him anchor himself in reality. "But you retained your own identity too? Your own memories and personality?" "Yes, though the balance has shifted over the years. In the beginning, Vincent Chen was dominant. I remembered my childhood in California, my parents who immigrated from Taiwan, my own reasons for enlisting in the army. But Harold's presence grew stronger over time, especially after I returned home and met your mother. The mention of our first meeting sent a chill through me. I remembered that day with perfect clarity, a chance encounter at the library where I'd been researching local history for a community project. Harold had approached me with a question about archived newspapers, and we'd ended up talking for hours about the town's development and our shared interest in preserving local heritage. It had felt like destiny, the beginning of a love story that would define the rest of my life. "When you met me," I said slowly, "were you Harold or Vincent?" "I was both, but Harold's feelings for you were so powerful that they overwhelmed everything else. I fell in love with you through his eyes, with his heart, carrying emotions that predated our actual meeting by months." Jessica had been quiet since Vincent's initial revelation, but now she spoke up with the determined voice of someone fighting to protect what remained of her understanding of her family. "Our childhood, our father's involvement in our lives, his love for us, was any of that real?" Vincent's expression softened with unmistakable tenderness as he looked at my youngest daughter. "Every moment of love you experienced from your father was absolutely real. Harold's devotion to his family was the strongest force I carried within me. When I held you as babies, when I taught you to ride bicycles, when I walked you down the aisle at your wedding, Jessica, those weren't performances or elaborate deceptions. They were expressions of the deepest love I've ever known." "But it wasn't our father expressing that love," Robert said, turning from the window with anguish written across his features. "It was you, channeling emotions that belonged to a dead man." "Does the source of love matter if the love itself is genuine?" Vincent asked quietly. "Harold's capacity for devotion lived on through me. The man who raised you, who celebrated your achievements and comforted you during difficult times, loved you with every fiber of his being, even if that being was more complex than you realized." The philosophical implications of Vincent's question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp but equally impossible to ignore. My children were grappling not just with the revelation that their father had died decades before they were born, but with questions about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the continuity of love across the boundaries of mortality. Linda, who had remained silent throughout most of Vincent's explanation, finally spoke with the practical directness that had always been her strength. "What about your own life, Vincent? Your own family? Your own dreams and aspirations? Did you give up everything that made you who you were to live Harold's life instead?" Vincent's smile carried decades of suppressed sorrow. Vincent Chen's life ended in that jungle just as surely as Harold's did. My parents received a military death notification in 1973, mourned their son, and eventually moved back to Taiwan. They died believing that their child had given his life for his country, never knowing that he survived by becoming someone else entirely. "That's heartbreaking," Jessica whispered, tears starting fresh in her eyes. "You sacrificed your own identity, your own relationships, your own future to honor a debt to a dying soldier." "I didn't experience it as sacrifice," Vincent replied. "Harold's life was rich and full and meaningful in ways that my own might never have been. Through him, I experienced the profound joy of marriage, the miracle of watching children grow into remarkable adults, the satisfaction of building something lasting and valuable." Margaret had been studying the financial documents while listening to our conversation, her analytical mind seeking concrete details that might help her process the emotional complexity of Vincent's story. "These investment strategies, the way you built and managed this portfolio, the sophisticated understanding of market dynamics, where did that expertise come from?" "From both of us," Vincent explained. Harold had always been interested in business and finance, but Vincent brought specific knowledge about emerging markets and international investment opportunities. The combination of Harold's strategic thinking and Vincent's cultural insights proved remarkably effective. Cultural insights. Having grown up in a Taiwanese-American household, I understood economic trends in Asia decades before most American investors recognized their significance. Harold's instincts about domestic markets combined with Vincent's knowledge of international opportunities created a powerful investment approach. I found myself marveling at the complexity of the existence Vincent had described, the delicate balance between two identities that had somehow merged into a single life. The man I'd loved had been a composite being, drawing strength and wisdom from two different backgrounds, two sets of experiences, two ways of understanding the world. "The secrecy," I said, a new question forming in my mind. "All these years, you maintained elaborate privacy about your business dealings, kept separate bank accounts, handled investments through intermediaries. Was that to protect the secret of your identity?" Vincent nodded. Harold was terrified that extensive financial scrutiny might reveal inconsistencies that would lead to questions about his background. The official Harold Baker had died in Vietnam, and creating a new legal identity required careful navigation of bureaucratic systems. It was safer to maintain a low profile and handle significant financial activities through trusted intermediaries. Robert returned to his chair, his expression cycling through anger, grief, and bewilderment. "So everything about our father was essentially a lie? His name, his history, his very existence?" "Everything about your father was essentially love," Vincent corrected gently. "Yes, the biographical details were complicated, but the emotions, the relationships, the commitment to family, those were the most authentic things I've ever experienced." "How do we know any of this is true?" Margaret demanded, her professional skepticism reasserting itself. "These documents could be fabricated. This entire story could be an elaborate confidence scheme designed to gain access to an elderly woman's resources." Vincent reached into his briefcase once more, withdrawing a small wooden box that looked handmade and well-worn. "This belonged to Harold. He carved it during long nights in Vietnam, working by candlelight when sleep wouldn't. Come." Inside, he kept letters from home, photographs of his parents, and a ring that had belonged to his grandfather. He opened the box to reveal its contents exactly as he'd described. The letters were yellowed with age, written in careful handwriting that I recognized immediately. My breath caught as I saw the signature at the bottom of one letter. "Love. Always, Harold Baker," in the same script that had appeared on birthday cards and anniversary gifts throughout our marriage. "I found this box and his belongings after the helicopter crash," Vincent continued. "Everything inside represented the life he was desperate to return to, the future he was fighting to preserve. When I felt his essence merging with mine, when his memories and emotions became part of my consciousness, this box became a sacred trust. Jessica leaned forward to examine the letters more closely. This handwriting, it's identical to Dad's. The same distinctive way he formed his letters, the same flourishes and spacing. Because I learned to write by channeling Harold's muscle memory, Vincent explained. In the early years after my return, I practiced for hours, training my hand to reproduce his movements, his style, his way of expressing himself on paper. "You learned to be our father," Robert said, his voice heavy with a complex mixture of admiration and horror. "I learned to honor his love for his family in the most complete way possible." The wooden box also contained a small silver ring, tarnished with age but still recognizable as a wedding band. Vincent lifted it carefully, holding it in his palm, as if it were a precious relic. Harold's grandfather gave him this ring when he enlisted, told him it would bring him home safely to the woman he was meant to marry. He wore it on a chain around his neck throughout his deployment, touching it whenever he felt afraid or homesick. I stared at the ring, remembering Harold's habit of unconsciously touching his chest when he was deep in thought or facing difficult decisions. I'd always assumed it was just a nervous gesture, never realizing he was reaching for a token that no longer hung there. "He wanted to give this to you when he proposed," Vincent continued, "but by the time I came home, the ring belonged to a dead man. Instead, I bought a new ring for our engagement, keeping this one as a private reminder of the promise I was trying to fulfill." The weight of Vincent's sacrifice was beginning to sink in. He had given up his own identity, his own family connections, his own future to live out the dreams of a dying soldier. For 50 years, he had maintained this elaborate deception not for personal gain, but to honor a debt that existed outside the normal boundaries of human obligation. "Why are you telling us all this now?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Vincent's expression grew even more serious, and I noticed that his breathing had become more labored during our conversation. Whatever was happening to him physically was clearly accelerating. Because the connection that has sustained me for 5 decades is finally breaking down. The merger of consciousness that allowed Harold's essence to live on through my body was never meant to be permanent. It was a gift, a miracle, an opportunity to complete unfinished business and express unexpressed love. "How long do you have?" Margaret asked, her lawyer's directness cutting through the emotional complexity of the moment. "Weeks, perhaps months. The doctors can't explain what's happening to me because they don't understand the supernatural nature of my condition. They see organ failure, systemic breakdown. But what's really happening is that 2 souls are finally separating after 5 decades of shared existence." Jessica was crying openly now, grieving not just for the father she'd thought she'd lost 3 years ago, but for the impending loss of the impossible being who had taken his place. "When you die, we'll lose both of you, won't we? Both Harold and Vincent will be gone." "Yes," Vincent replied simply. "Harold's essence will finally find peace, and Vincent Chen will complete a journey that should have ended in Vietnam 50 years ago." The finality of his words settled over us like a weight. My family was facing a loss that defied conventional understanding, the death of 2 men who had somehow shared a single life, the end of a love story that had transcended the normal boundaries of mortality. "The money," Robert said suddenly. "The billion-dollar portfolio? What happens to that after you're gone?" Vincent smiled, and for a moment I saw a flash of the Harold I remembered, the expression of quiet satisfaction he wore when he'd solved a particularly challenging problem. That was Harold's final gift to his family. Every investment decision, every financial strategy, every dollar of accumulated wealth was designed to ensure that Dolly would be provided for and that his children would inherit a legacy worthy of the love he felt for them. Even knowing that we might never learn the truth about where it came from, Harold hoped that eventually, when the time was right, the truth would be revealed. He wanted his family to understand that his love for them was so powerful it survived death itself, so enduring that it motivated 50 years of careful planning and sacrifice. Margaret was still studying the legal documents, her analytical mind working to understand the practical implications of Vincent's revelation. These trust structures, the way the assets are organized, they're designed to transfer cleanly to Mom, regardless of what happens to you. Harold was very thorough in his planning. He understood that Vincent Chen would eventually die, possibly, under circumstances that might raise questions about the legitimacy of his financial activities. Everything was structured to ensure that Dolly's inheritance would be unquestionable and immediately accessible. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chiming from Vincent's phone. He glanced at the screen, and his expression grew concerned. "I'm sorry, but I need to take this call. It's from my medical team." He stepped onto my front porch, closing the door behind him to conduct his conversation in private. Through the window, I could see him pacing slowly, his posture indicating that the news he was receiving wasn't encouraging. In his absence, my family turned to me with a mixture of confusion, concern, and barely suppressed panic. The revelations of the evening had shattered their understanding of our family history while raising new questions about my welfare and the future. "Mom, how are you processing all of this?" Jessica asked gently. "Learning that your husband died decades before you met him, that your marriage was to someone channeling his consciousness, this has to be incredibly traumatic." I considered her question carefully, surprised to realize that my dominant emotion wasn't devastation or betrayal, but rather a profound sense of gratitude. I'm processing it by remembering 37 years of genuine love, authentic devotion, and real partnership. Whether that love came from Harold directly or through Vincent doesn't diminish its value or its impact on our lives. But doesn't it feel like a deception? Robert asked. Don't you feel manipulated or betrayed by the fact that the man you married wasn't who you thought he was? The man I married was exactly who I thought he was in every way that mattered. He was kind, intelligent, devoted to his family, committed to building a secure future for the people he loved. The complexity of his identity doesn't change the authenticity of his character or his feelings. Margaret was shaking her head slowly, her lawyer's mind struggling to reconcile the emotional acceptance I was expressing with the factual impossibility of the situation. Mom, you're talking about this as if it's a romantic love story, but what Vincent is describing challenges everything we understand about the nature of human existence. Maybe our understanding of human existence is more limited than we realized, I replied. Maybe love is powerful enough to transcend death, consciousness is more fluid than we assumed, and the boundaries between one life and another aren't as absolute as we've been taught to believe. Vincent returned from his phone call looking even more pale and strained than when he'd left. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if each step required conscious effort. I'm afraid the news isn't good, he said as he settled back into his chair. My condition is deteriorating more rapidly than the doctors anticipated. The separation process appears to be accelerating. What does that mean in practical terms? Margaret asked, her professional instincts taking over despite the emotional chaos of the evening. It means that I have days rather than weeks or months. The connection that has sustained me for 5 decades is finally dissolving, and my body can't survive without Harold's essence to supplement my own failing systems. The news hit the room like a physical blow. Jessica immediately moved to sit beside me, her hand finding mine as we faced the prospect of losing Harold for a second time. Robert slumped back in his chair as if the weight of Vincent's words had pushed him down. Margaret remained standing, but her rigid posture suggested she was fighting to maintain control in the face of overwhelming emotion. Is there anything we can do? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Vincent smiled with infinite gentleness. You can let me use whatever time remains to complete Harold's final mission. There are things he wanted to tell each of you, messages he's been carrying for 50 years, waiting for the right moment to deliver them. What kind of messages? Personal ones, expressions of pride, gratitude, love, and hope that Harold has been saving for this moment. He knew that eventually the truth about his survival would be revealed, and he wanted to ensure that each of his children understood how much joy they brought to his existence. Jessica was crying again, but there was something different about her tears now. Instead of the grief and confusion that had dominated her emotions throughout the evening, she seemed to be experiencing a kind of anticipatory healing, as if the prospect of hearing final words from her father might provide closure she hadn't realized she needed. "How does this work?" she asked. "How do you deliver messages from a consciousness that merged with yours 50 years ago?" "Harold's thoughts and feelings are as much a part of me as my own memories and emotions. When I speak his words, they carry the full weight of his love and the authority of his genuine feelings. You'll know they're really from him because they'll contain knowledge and insights that only your father could possess." Vincent closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, his expression had subtly changed. The professional composure that had characterized his demeanor throughout the evening had been replaced by something warmer, more familiar. When he spoke, his voice carried inflections that I recognized from decades of marriage. "Margaret," he said, and my eldest daughter's breath caught at the subtle shift in his tone. "Your father wants you to know that watching you develop into a brilliant attorney has been one of the greatest privileges of his existence. He's so proud of your intelligence, your integrity, your commitment to justice." Margaret's hands trembled as she absorbed words that seemed to come directly from the father she remembered. "Dad? He wants you to know that he understands why you felt responsible for protecting your mother after his apparent death. Your sense of duty, your desire to manage and control situations to ensure everyone's safety, those traits come from him. But he also wants you to know that your mother is stronger and more capable than you realize, and that sometimes love means trusting the people you care about to make their own decisions." The accuracy of Vincent's observations, the way he seemed to understand Margaret's personality and motivations from an intimate parental perspective, left no doubt that Harold's consciousness was indeed speaking through him. Margaret sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the experience of receiving guidance from a father she'd thought was forever lost. Vincent turned to Robert, his expression shifting again to accommodate different memories and relationships. "Robert, your father sees how hard you've worked to build a stable, secure life for your family. He's proud of your business success, but he's even more proud of the man you've become. Kind, generous, committed to taking care of the people you love. He wants you to know that the anxiety you sometimes feel about providing for your family, the worry that you might not be successful enough or wealthy enough to ensure their security, those concerns are unnecessary. You've already succeeded in the most important ways. Your children adore you, your wife respects you, and you've built a life based on solid values and genuine love." Robert was struggling to maintain his composure, years of unexpressed grief and guilt rising to the surface as he heard his father's final affirmations. "I should have spent more time with him. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many conversations we never had." "Harold knows," Vincent replied gently. "He felt your love even when it wasn't expressed in words. The fact that you've dedicated your life to honoring his values and his memory tells him everything he needs to know about your feelings." Finally, Vincent turned to Jessica, his youngest child, and perhaps the one who had been most devastated by Harold's apparent death 3 years earlier. When he looked at her, his entire demeanor softened with the special tenderness that fathers reserve for their babies, regardless of how old those children might be. "Jessica, your father wants you to know that you have been the light of his existence from the moment you were born. Your compassion, your ability to find joy in simple things, your gift for bringing people together and creating harmony in difficult situations. These qualities have brought him more happiness than you could possibly imagine. He knows that losing him was especially hard for you because you had such a close relationship. He wants you to understand that the bond you shared was real and lasting, that love doesn't end when physical presence ends, and that he will always be with you in the values he taught you and the memories you created together. Jessica was sobbing now, but her tears seemed to carry both grief and relief. I miss him so much. Every day, I miss him. And he has missed you too, Vincent replied. But he's also been incredibly proud to watch you raise your children with the same love and attention he tried to give you. You're an extraordinary mother, Jessica, and your father sees his own commitment to family living on through your dedication to Michael and Sarah. The experience of hearing Harold's final messages delivered through Vincent's voice was both heartbreaking and healing. My children were receiving the closure that his sudden death had denied them, while simultaneously grappling with the supernatural circumstances that made these final conversations possible. As Vincent finished delivering Harold's personal messages, I noticed that his physical condition appeared to be deteriorating even during our conversation. His breathing was more labored, his color was poor, and he seemed to be struggling to maintain his focus. "Vincent," I said gently, "you mentioned that you only have days remaining. What do you need from us during this time?" He smiled with infinite weariness. "I need you to understand that Harold's love for this family was the defining force of his existence, even after death. Everything he did, every sacrifice he made, every decision about how to use his extended time was motivated by his desire to ensure your happiness and security. And I need you to know that Vincent Chen's life, while different from what he originally planned, was rich and meaningful beyond anything he could have imagined. Being entrusted with Harold's love, being allowed to experience the joy of family through borrowed time, has been the greatest honor of my existence." The weight of Vincent's words settled over us like a benediction. We were witnessing the end of an impossible love story, the conclusion of a supernatural sacrifice that had shaped 5 decades of our family's history. In just a few days, we would lose both Harold and Vincent, but we would gain an understanding of love's power to transcend even death itself. 3 days later, Vincent collapsed in my kitchen while helping me prepare morning coffee. I found him, on the floor beside the counter, conscious but unable to stand, his breathing shallow and his skin translucent with the pallor of approaching death. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but even as the paramedics worked to stabilize him, I could see in Vincent's eyes that our time together was drawing to its inevitable close. At the hospital, Dr. Reeves spoke to our family with the gentle directness that medical professionals reserve for terminal diagnoses. Vincent's organs were shutting down systematically, but the pattern of his decline didn't match any known disease process. His condition was unique, inexplicable by conventional medical standards, as if his body was simply choosing to stop functioning. "We can keep him comfortable," Dr. Reeves explained, "but there's nothing we can do to reverse what's happening. I'm sorry, but you should prepare for the end to come very soon." Margaret took charge of the practical arrangements with her characteristic efficiency, ensuring that Vincent had a private room and that our family would be allowed unrestricted access during his final hours. Jessica brought flowers from her garden, filling the sterile hospital room with the scent of late autumn blooms. Robert handled the legal formalities, working with Vincent to ensure that all financial documents were properly executed and that my inheritance would transfer seamlessly upon his death. As evening approached, Vincent asked to speak with each of my children individually, offering them final opportunities to ask questions or seek clarity about the extraordinary circumstances of his existence. Margaret went first, spending nearly an hour in quiet conversation that seemed to bring her a measure of peace she'd been missing since Harold's apparent death 3 years earlier. Robert's conversation was shorter but equally meaningful, focused on practical concerns about the future and assurances that Vincent had fulfilled every aspect of Harold's intentions for the family's financial security. When he emerged from Vincent's room, Robert's eyes were red with tears, but his posture carried a new sense of resolution. Jessica's time with Vincent lasted the longest, their voices too quiet for the rest of us to overhear, but their emotional connection visible through the glass door of his hospital room. When she finally came out, she was crying, but also smiling, as if Vincent had given her something precious that she would carry forward into her own family's future. Finally, it was my turn to say goodbye to the man who had been my husband in ways that defied conventional understanding. Vincent looked impossibly frail against the white hospital sheets, but his eyes still held the warmth and intelligence that had first drawn me to Harold all those decades ago. "Dolly," he said softly, reaching for my hand with fingers that felt as delicate as tissue paper. "I need you to know that every day of our marriage was a gift I never expected to receive." I settled into the chair beside his bed, my own hand encompassing his with the gentle care reserved for precious, fragile things. "You gave me 37 years of love that I thought I'd lost forever. You honored Harold's memory by living his dreams, but you also created something beautiful that was uniquely yours. Harold's love for you was so powerful that it sustained me through 5 decades of borrowed time. But somewhere along the way, Vincent learned to love you too, not just as Harold's widow, but as the remarkable woman who made this impossible existence worthwhile." His words carried the weight of a final confession, an acknowledgement that the boundary between Harold's emotions and Vincent's own feelings had blurred beyond recognition over the years. The man who had channeled my husband's consciousness had eventually developed his own deep affection for the life they'd shared together. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Now, Harold finally gets to rest, and Vincent gets to complete a journey that should have ended 50 years ago. But the love we shared, the family we built, the legacy we created together, that continues through you and the children and their children. Vincent's breathing grew more labored as we talked, but he seemed determined to use his remaining strength to ensure that I understood the full scope of what we'd experienced together. "The $1 billion isn't just financial security, Dolly. It's proof that love can transcend every boundary, even death itself. Harold worked for 50 years to build something that would protect and provide for his family long after both of us were gone." As the night deepened, our family gathered around Vincent's bed in a vigil that felt both mournful and celebratory. We were witnessing the end of an impossible love story, but we were also honoring a sacrifice that had given us decades of happiness we otherwise never would have known. Vincent slept fitfully, his breathing growing increasingly irregular as his body struggled to maintain functions that were systematically failing. During his wakeful moments, he spoke softly about memories that belonged to both Harold and Vincent, stories that wove together 2 lives into a single narrative of devotion and purpose. Near dawn, Vincent opened his eyes with sudden clarity, his gaze moving around the room to take in each of our faces one final time. When he spoke, his voice carried a strength that seemed to come from beyond his failing body. "Harold wants you to know that he died happy," he said, his words directed to all of us, but his eyes focused on me. "He died knowing that his love would continue, that his family would be protected, that his sacrifice had meaning. And Vincent wants you to know that he lived happy, blessed beyond measure to be entrusted with such precious responsibilities." Margaret leaned forward, tears streaming down her face. "Will we see you again? Either of you?" Vincent's smile was radiant despite his physical weakness. "Love never truly ends, Margaret. It changes form, finds new expressions, but it never disappears entirely. Harold's love for this family will live on through every act of kindness you show each other, every moment of joy you create together, every time you remember that you are cherished beyond measure." As the sun began to rise outside Vincent's hospital window, painting the room in shades of gold and amber, His breathing became increasingly shallow. We gathered closer, holding hands around his bed in a circle of connection that honored both the man who was dying and the one whose essence would finally find peace. Vincent's last words were spoken so softly that we had to lean in to hear them. "Thank you for letting me love you." He died as peacefully as anyone could hope, his face relaxing into an expression of profound serenity as whatever supernatural force had sustained him for 5 decades finally released its hold. In that moment, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room, as if two souls that had been intertwined for half a century were finally separating and moving toward their respective destinations. The funeral arrangements presented unique challenges that reflected the complexity of Vincent's existence. Officially, we were burying Vincent Chen, a financial advisor who had become an important part of our family's life. But emotionally, we were also saying goodbye to Harold Baker, the husband and father whose love had transcended death in ways that challenged every conventional understanding of mortality. Margaret worked with the funeral director to create a service that honored both aspects of Vincent's identity without raising questions that couldn't be answered publicly. The obituary described Vincent as a devoted financial advisor and family friend who had played an instrumental role in ensuring our security and well-being. Those who attended the service saw only what they expected to see: a family grieving the loss of a trusted professional who had become personally important to them. But for those of us who knew the truth, the funeral was a celebration of love's triumph over death, a testament to the power of devotion to transcend even the most absolute of boundaries. We buried Vincent Chen while privately honoring Harold Baker, acknowledging both the sacrifice that had made our family possible and the generosity that had sustained us through 5 decades of hidden blessing. In the weeks that followed Vincent's death, the practical aspects of my inheritance began to take shape. The financial institutions that had managed our investments for years transferred control seamlessly to me, just as Vincent had promised they would. The billion-dollar portfolio was suddenly and completely mine, transforming me from a widow living on modest means into one of the wealthiest women in the state. My children struggled initially with the magnitude of this change, but gradually, they began to understand that the money represented something far more valuable than material wealth. It was Harold's final expression of love, his way of ensuring that his family would never face the kind of economic uncertainty that had motivated his obsessive attention to financial planning during his lifetime. Margaret helped me establish a foundation dedicated to supporting military families, particularly those dealing with loss or trauma related to overseas service. The Vincent Chen Memorial Foundation became a way to honor both men's service while providing practical assistance to families facing challenges similar to those we'd experienced. Robert worked with me to create educational trusts for his children and Jessica's twins, ensuring that Harold's great-grandchildren would have every opportunity to pursue their dreams without financial constraints. The money that Vincent had, so carefully accumulated over the years, became a tool for expanding possibilities rather than simply accumulating wealth. Jessica suggested that we use part of the inheritance to purchase and preserve the park where Vincent and I had held our weekly meetings. The Vincent Chen Memorial Garden became a quiet place of reflection, marked by a simple bench where visitors could sit and contemplate the mysteries of love, loss, and the connections that bind families together across time and circumstance. As the months passed, I found myself adapting to my new circumstances with surprising ease. The wealth that Vincent had accumulated gave me freedom to make choices based on preference rather than necessity, but it didn't fundamentally change who I was or how I wanted to live. I remained in my house on Maple Street, continued my involvement in community organizations, and maintained the relationships that had sustained me throughout my adult life. What did change was my family's perception of me. My children no longer saw me as their aging mother who required constant monitoring and protection. Instead, they recognized me as a woman who had lived through extraordinary circumstances while maintaining her strength, wisdom, and independence. The concerns about my mental competency that had dominated our relationships just months earlier had been replaced by genuine respect for my resilience and judgment. The truth about Vincent's identity remained our family's most closely guarded secret. We had sworn to each other that the supernatural aspects of his story would never be shared with anyone outside our immediate circle. But among ourselves, we spoke freely about Harold's continued presence in our lives, the ways his love continued to influence our decisions and relationships, and the gratitude we felt for having been given extra decades with a father who should have died in Vietnam. Jessica's twins, Michael and Sarah, began asking questions about their grandfather that revealed how much family stories had shaped their understanding of love and commitment. Without revealing the impossible circumstances of Harold's survival, we were able to share with them the essential truth that their grandfather's devotion to family had been so powerful that it continued to bless their lives even after his death. 1 year after Vincent's death, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Martinez, the geriatrician who had evaluated my mental competency during the crisis over Vincent's existence, came to my house carrying a medical journal and wearing an expression of profound curiosity. "Mrs. Baker," he said after I'd invited him in for coffee, "I've been following up on some research related to your case, and I've discovered some fascinating information about consciousness, memory, and the ways that deep, emotional connections can manifest in ways that challenge our understanding of individual identity." I listened carefully as Dr. Martinez described recent studies suggesting that human consciousness might be far more fluid and interconnected than previously understood. Researchers were documenting cases of individuals who seemed to access memories and knowledge that belonged to other people, particularly in situations involving intense emotional bonds or traumatic experiences. What you described during our consultation, your relationship with Vincent Chen, the detailed conversations and professional interactions you reported having with him, they don't fit the typical pattern of dementia-related hallucinations, Dr. Martinez explained. They suggest something far more complex and potentially more remarkable. I chose my words carefully, unwilling to reveal the full truth about Vincent's supernatural existence, but grateful for professional validation that my experiences had been more than simple delusions. Vincent was a very important part of my life during a difficult period. His guidance and support helped me navigate challenges that I couldn't have managed alone. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "I suspect that Vincent Chen was exactly as real as you insisted he was, though perhaps not in ways that conventional medical practice is prepared to acknowledge or explain." His visit provided a form of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. The medical professional who had been asked to evaluate my sanity was now suggesting that my experiences might represent something far more profound than mental decline. While he couldn't know the full truth about Vincent's identity, Dr. Martinez's research validated my insistence that love and connection could manifest in ways that transcended normal human understanding. As I approached my 75th birthday, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this point in my life. I had been married to a man whose love was so powerful that it survived death, channeled through another person's consciousness, and sustained across 50 years of borrowed time. I had been blessed with children who learned to see beyond conventional explanations to embrace mysteries that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The $1 billion that Vincent had accumulated sat in carefully managed accounts, generating returns that would support multiple generations of my family while funding charitable work that honored both Harold's and Vincent's service to their country. But the money was ultimately just a symbol of something far more valuable: the proof that love could triumph over every obstacle, including death itself. My weekly visits to the Vincent Chen Memorial Garden became a source of comfort and reflection, a place where I could sit quietly and feel the presence of both men who had shaped my life in such profound ways. Sometimes visitors would join me on the bench, drawn by the peaceful atmosphere and the sense that this simple place held meaning beyond its modest appearance. I never spoke to these strangers about the supernatural love story that the garden commemorated, but I often found myself sharing more general observations about the power of devotion, the importance of family, and the ways that love could manifest in unexpected forms. These conversations reminded me that Harold and Vincent's story, while unique in its specific circumstances, represented universal truths about human connection and the enduring nature of genuine affection. The children and grandchildren who benefited from Harold's legacy would probably never fully understand the extraordinary circumstances that made their opportunities possible. But they would grow up knowing that they were deeply loved, carefully provided for, and part of a family tradition that valued commitment, sacrifice, and the willingness to put others' well-being ahead of personal comfort. As I sat in my garden, on quiet evenings, watching the sun set behind the maple tree that had witnessed so many seasons of my life, I felt profound gratitude for the impossible blessing I'd received. Most widows face the future alone, supported by memories and whatever provisions their husbands had been able to make during their lifetimes. But I had been given something far more precious: 50 years of continued love, expressed through Vincent's devoted stewardship of Harold's dreams and devotion. The story of Vincent Chen and Harold Baker would remain our family's most treasured secret, a testament to love's power to transcend every limitation, even death itself. And I would spend whatever years remained to me honoring their sacrifice by living fully, loving deeply, and ensuring that their legacy of devotion continued to bless future generations in ways that neither man could have imagined when their lives first intersected in a Vietnamese jungle so many decades ago. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.